The foreman had always been a man of routine. Every day, he would walk the same paths across the colony site, checking machines, inspecting safety measures, and ensuring his team followed all the rules. Life on this remote planet was not easy, but he had grown used to it. The air was thin, the ground rough, and the forests around the settlement were full of unknown sounds that could startle even the bravest worker. But he never imagined that one routine day would change his life forever. It started early in the morning, just as the red sun of the alien planet was beginning to rise over the horizon. The sky was painted in shades of pink and orange, casting long shadows over the dusty settlement. The foreman had finished his morning rounds and was heading back toward the storage units when he heard a soft, trembling sound that made him stop in his tracks. At first, he thought it was the wind rustling through the alien trees, but then he realized it was a cry, weak and pained, coming from the forest just beyond the fence. He froze, listening closely. The sound was unmistakable now. It was not the cry of a human child, but something else, something he had only read about in reports. The colony had strict rules about wildlife, especially the apex predators of the planet. They were known to be dangerous, vicious, and nearly impossible to tame. Entire teams had been lost to these creatures in the past, and the foreman knew the warnings well. Yet something inside him stirred. He could not ignore the sound of suffering. His heart, conditioned by years of responsibility and care for his workers, refused to turn away. Slowly, cautiously, he moved toward the forest. Every step he took on the uneven ground made him more aware of the danger. The forest here was thick, with twisted roots and sharp rocks. The air smelled of wet soil and something metallic, a scent he had learned to associate with the planet's native life forms. He followed the sound, weaving carefully between trees and underbrush. The cries grew louder, more desperate, and soon he came upon a small clearing. There, huddled together under the shadow of a fallen tree, were the cubs. They were smaller than he expected, their fur matted with dirt, and their eyes wide with fear. Their bodies were thin, trembling with cold, and some of them had scratches and bruises as if they had been left to survive on their own in the harsh wilderness. The foreman's first instinct was to step back. These were apex predators, creatures that could easily overpower a human, even at their small size. But as he looked closer, he saw the unmistakable signs of helplessness. One cub tried to stand, but collapsed almost immediately. Another shivered violently, making soft whining sounds. It was clear that they were abandoned, likely left to die, because their species was feared and misunderstood by everyone else in the colony. He swallowed hard, knowing that what he was about to do was against every rule he had ever followed. The colony had strict orders to report or eliminate any of these creatures found near human settlements. Yet, the foreman could not turn away. He had saved lives before, workers trapped under machinery, explorers lost in the desert terrain, but this was different. These creatures were not human. They were not machines. They were alive, innocent, and entirely dependent on someone else for survival. And that someone, at least at that moment, had to be him. He knelt down slowly, keeping his hands visible and his movements gentle. The cubs backed away at first, their instincts warning them to flee, but hunger and weakness kept them from running far. He whispered softly, even though he knew they might not understand the words. "It's okay," he said. "I won't hurt you. I just want to help." He extended a hand, and after a long pause, one of the smaller cubs edged closer, sniffing his fingers cautiously. That moment, brief and fragile, changed everything. The foreman realized that fear and mistrust could be overcome with patience and care. He carefully picked up the trembling cub, feeling its tiny body relax slightly in his arms. It was a strange sensation, holding a creature that could one day grow to be one of the most dangerous beings in the colony. Yet now, It relied entirely on him for warmth and protection. He knew he couldn't leave them in the forest, not in their condition. The air was cold, and the terrain was dangerous. They needed food, water, and shelter, things only humans could provide. With a deep breath, he made his decision. He would take them back to the settlement, hide them if necessary, and care for them. The risks were enormous, but the alternative, the thought of leaving them to starve or be killed by other predators, was unbearable. Carrying the first cub carefully, he crept back through the forest, guiding the others along. He used scraps of cloth to wrap them and improvised a small carrying system so none would fall behind. The journey was slow, each step calculated to avoid loud noises that might draw unwanted attention. He felt a mix of fear and exhilaration, a tension that tightened his chest, but also filled him with a strange sense of purpose. By the time he reached the edge of the settlement, the sun was fully above the horizon. Workers were starting their day, moving equipment and preparing for another long shift. The foreman slipped through unnoticed, heading straight for the storage shelter where he could create a temporary space for the cubs. He used old crates, soft padding, and whatever supplies he could find to make them comfortable. It was far from perfect, but it was a start. For hours, he tended to them. He cleaned their fur, wrapped them in cloths, and offered nutrient packs he had on hand for emergencies. At first, they were wary, snapping softly and pulling away. But hunger and exhaustion won over fear, and gradually they began to accept him. One by one, the cubs licked his hands, nuzzled against his chest, and even fell asleep near him. The foreman had never felt anything like it before, a deep, quiet bond forming between human and alien creatures, built on trust, care, and the most basic instinct to survive. By the end of the day, he was exhausted, physically and emotionally. His arms ached from holding the cubs. His mind raced with the dangers he knew lay ahead, but there was also a sense of quiet satisfaction. He had made a choice that no one else would have made, and for now, it had worked. The cubs were safe, and he had proved, at least to himself, that compassion could exist even in the most unlikely circumstances. As night fell, he sat by the shelter, watching the cubs sleep. He thought about the reports he would have to face, the questions from the colony council, and the skepticism of his own workers. But none of that mattered in that moment. He had made a promise, silent and unspoken, to protect these abandoned creatures. And somehow, he knew that this promise was the beginning of a story far bigger than he could imagine, a story that would test his courage, his patience, and his understanding of what it truly meant to care for another life, no matter how different it might be. For the first time, he allowed himself a small smile. Tomorrow, the real challenge would begin. He would have to keep the cubs alive, find ways to feed them, and figure out how to live alongside them in a world that feared what they were. But tonight, they were safe. And for him, that was enough. As he drifted into a restless sleep, the cubs huddled together, their tiny bodies warming each other, and the man who had chosen to be their guardian. The foreman did not know what the future held, but one thing was certain. He had made a choice that would change everything for the cubs, for the colony, and for himself. And somehow, deep down, he knew this was only the beginning. After the first night with the cubs, the foreman realized that caring for them was going to be far more complicated than he had imagined. The moment he had brought them into the storage shelter, he had crossed an invisible line, and he knew the colony rules would not forgive him if anyone found out. These creatures were not ordinary animals. They were feared across the settlement. Reports called them dangerous, uncontrollable, and aggressive, capable of destroying machines, crops, or even humans if provoked. And yet, in front of him, they were helpless, innocent, and completely dependent on his care. The next morning, as sunlight poured through the small cracks in the shelter walls, he carefully checked on each cub. They had survived the night, though some were still weak and trembling. One of the cubs, slightly larger than the others, climbed clumsily over the makeshift bedding and nuzzled his arm. He smiled softly, feeling a mix of relief and concern. Feeding them was the first challenge. The colony did not provide rations for alien species, and these cubs required something specific, something nutritious that would keep them alive and help them grow strong. He spent hours improvising. He crushed some nutrient packs he used for emergencies, mixed them with warm water, and fed them slowly from bottles. At first, the cubs resisted. They hissed softly, showing tiny but sharp teeth, their instincts warning them to be cautious. But hunger and fatigue eventually won over fear. One by one, they began to lap at the mixture, and their trembling slowed. The foreman watched quietly, feeling a strange mixture of pride and worry. Every small sign of trust was a victory, but he knew this was just the beginning. His workers, meanwhile, began noticing his absence from routine tasks. Some followed him discreetly, and eventually discovered the cubs in the shelter. The reactions were instant and intense. One worker stepped back in horror, his eyes wide. What are those?" he whispered. Another muttered about colony rules, about how keeping these creatures alive was forbidden. Fear spread quickly, and soon the foreman found himself surrounded by skepticism, worry, and even anger. Despite the criticism, he remained calm. He explained gently that the cubs were abandoned, weak, and in need of care. "They are just babies," he said. "They cannot survive on their own. If we turn away, they will die." Many shook their heads, some muttering that he was crazy, others that he was inviting disaster. But he did not let their words change him. Deep down, he knew that saving these cubs was the right thing to do. The foreman had always believed that courage was not about fearlessness, but about making the right choice, even when it was hard. And this was harder than anything he had faced before. Over the next few days, he developed a routine. Early mornings were spent preparing food, checking their injuries, and ensuring they were warm and safe. Afternoons were dedicated to teaching them simple commands and building trust. He learned to understand the small signs of alien behavior: a tilt of the head, a flick of the tail, a low growl that meant discomfort. Slowly, the cubs began to respond. One would come running when he called, another would crawl onto his lap seeking warmth, and the smallest one would nuzzle his hand whenever he entered the room. The foreman also had to be careful. These cubs, though small, were still predators. Their claws could scratch, their teeth could bite, and their instincts were strong. He learned to anticipate their movements, to approach slowly, and to avoid sudden gestures. It was a delicate dance of trust, patience, and observation. He discovered that patience was not just about waiting. It was about understanding, about reading the silent language of creatures so different from humans, yet capable of forming bonds stronger than most people could imagine. Word of his unusual adoption spread beyond the shelter. Some people were curious, others cautious, and a few openly hostile. One of the colony supervisors visited unexpectedly, demanding an explanation. The foreman stayed composed, showing only what he had to. He explained the cubs' condition, their injuries, and their need for care. The supervisor shook his head, warning him about the risks. They grow fast. You can't control them forever. Colony rules exist for a reason. You could be held responsible if they attack anyone or anything. The foreman listened carefully. He did not argue, but he also did not surrender the cubs. "I understand the risks," he said quietly, "but if we don't give them a chance, they will die. I cannot let that happen." There was a pause. The supervisor's eyes softened slightly as he looked at the cubs, who were watching from the corner of the shelter, eyes wide and trusting. He turned and left, muttering that he hoped the foreman knew what he was doing. Despite the warnings, Life with the cubs gradually became a rhythm. He taught them to eat from small containers, to recognize simple commands, and even to play gently with each other. They learned to follow his voice, to stay near him, and to respond to small gestures. Watching them grow, he felt a sense of accomplishment unlike anything he had experienced on the colony. These creatures, feared by everyone else, were learning to trust him, relying on his care in a way that made him feel deeply responsible. But the challenges were far from over. The cub's growth was rapid, faster than he expected. One morning, he realized that the smallest cub, barely a few days old when he found it, was already strong enough to climb the walls of the shelter. He had to reinforce the space, creating higher barriers and safer zones to prevent accidents. At the same time, he had to ensure they did not injure each other. Playful behavior could quickly turn dangerous with sharp teeth and claws, and he had to intervene carefully, teaching boundaries without frightening them. There were moments of fear, too. One afternoon, while feeding them, a loud noise from outside startled the cubs. They hissed and bared their tiny teeth, their instincts kicking in. For a second, the foreman froze, heart pounding. But he remained calm, speaking softly, moving slowly, and gradually they settled again. It was a reminder that their nature was not gone. It was only tempered by care, trust, and guidance. He understood that one mistake could have consequences, yet he refused to let fear dominate him. Over time, the bond between the foreman and the cubs grew deeper. They began to recognize his presence instantly, rushing toward him whenever he entered the shelter. He would spend hours simply observing them, noticing subtle patterns in their behavior. One would tilt its head in curiosity, another would rest its paw on the smallest one in a protective gesture, and all of them would look to him for guidance when uncertain. In those moments, he felt a connection unlike anything he had ever known, a silent understanding that transcended species, a trust built on patience, care, and unwavering presence. The foreman also found unexpected lessons in their behavior. Watching them, he learned patience, empathy, and resilience. Each cub had its own personality. Some were bold and curious, others shy and cautious, but all were survivors. Their determination to live, despite injury and fear, inspired him to reflect on his own life. He realized that caring for these creatures was not just about saving them. It was also about learning to nurture, to guide, and to trust in the goodness of his own choices. Despite the isolation and criticism, he never regretted his decision. Every small step the first time, a cub ate from his hand without hesitation. The first playful pounce without fear, the first time they all slept together without trembling, was a victory. He knew the colony might never fully understand, and many would continue to call him foolish. But he also knew that he had made a difference. For the cubs, he was their world, their protector, and their guide. As days turned into weeks, the foreman faced other challenges, finding sustainable food, dealing with the curiosity of other workers, and managing the growing energy of the cubs. But he faced each challenge with calm determination, learning to adapt, improvise, and maintain the delicate balance between care and safety. Slowly, a small community of understanding and trust formed around him. Those who observed him quietly began to respect his choices. Recognizing that his bond with the cubs was real and meaningful. By the end of the second part of his journey, the foreman had not only saved the cubs' lives, but had also created a new world for them, a place where fear was replaced with trust, danger with guidance, and abandonment with care. The colony, the workers, and even the cubs themselves began to see him not just as a foreman, but as a guardian, someone willing to stand against fear, rules, and uncertainty to do what was right. And while the days ahead promised even greater challenges, growth, strength, and the inevitable attention of the colony council, he felt a quiet certainty. He had chosen a path few would dare to take, and in doing so, he had opened a door to something extraordinary. The cubs were no longer just abandoned creatures in the forest. They were alive because of him, and every small moment of trust and care was a testament to the power of compassion, courage, and belief in the impossible. Life with the cubs was becoming both a challenge and a joy for the foreman. Each day brought new lessons, small victories, and occasional moments of fear. The cubs were growing faster than he had imagined, and their playful energy sometimes made the shelter feel like a storm had passed through it. Claws scratched the walls, teeth gnawed on old wood, and yet, beneath the chaos, there was a strange harmony. The foreman could see it in their eyes, a mixture of fear, curiosity, and growing trust. They were learning that he was not a threat, and he was learning, in turn, how to guide creatures so different from humans, yet so full of life. It was during one of these busy mornings that the foreman first noticed the reactions of the colony workers. Rumors had already started to spread. Some whispered about the cubs being dangerous. Others were fascinated. A few workers, braver than the rest, watched him secretly from a distance, curious about how a human could tame such creatures. When they finally saw the cubs respond to his voice, their fear turned into astonishment. The cubs would stop playing and turn toward him, obeying his small commands. One of the larger cubs would even sit quietly while he approached, something no human had expected from a member of its species. Not all reactions were positive. Some of the older workers openly criticized him, calling him foolish and reckless. "They'll grow too strong. One day, they'll turn on you or someone else," one man said sharply, shaking his head. Another whispered that the colony council would punish him if they discovered what he was doing. Yet, despite the constant warnings, the foreman refused to let fear dictate his actions. He had seen helplessness before, in injured workers, lost explorers, and abandoned equipment. He had always chosen compassion over caution, and this was no different. One afternoon, as he was preparing food for the cubs, the smallest one stumbled and fell into a shallow puddle outside the shelter. The foreman rushed over, scooping it up quickly. Its fur was soaked, and it shivered violently. At that moment, he realized that caring for these cubs was not just about feeding them, it was about protecting them from every danger, no matter how small. The colony environment itself was a constant threat, from harsh weather to unpredictable wildlife. He had to think like a parent, a guardian, and a teacher all at once. Over the next few days, he worked tirelessly to create a safer space. He reinforced the shelter walls, added soft bedding, and even built small climbing areas to keep the cubs entertained while minimizing the risk of injury. Every improvement was made with careful observation. He noticed subtle behaviors. The way one cub tilted its head when confused, the way another pawed gently at him when seeking attention. Each gesture taught him more about their personalities, their moods, and their capacity for trust. The foreman also began experimenting with simple training techniques. He learned that the cubs responded not only to voice, but also to touch and gestures. A hand raised slowly could mean, "Stop." A soft pat on the ground could mean, "Come." These small lessons were not just about control. They were about communication. The cubs were learning that he could be trusted, and he was learning that patience and consistency could build bonds stronger than fear. Not all moments were peaceful. One day, a loud noise from the colony startled the cubs. They hissed and bared their teeth, instincts taking over in an instant. The foreman froze, heart pounding, as he slowly approached them. Speaking softly, he extended his hand and moved cautiously. Gradually, the cubs relaxed, curling back into the bedding. It was a reminder that while trust could be built, instincts could never be entirely erased. Every moment with them required vigilance, understanding, and calm determination. As the cubs grew, their energy became harder to manage. They were curious, playful, and sometimes mischievous. One cub learned how to climb a storage rack. Another discovered that biting the edge of a crate could produce a satisfying sound. The foreman had to constantly adapt, finding ways to channel their energy safely. He built small obstacle courses, used toys made from old materials, and even created puzzles to challenge their growing intelligence. It was exhausting, but it also brought joy. Watching the cubs explore, play, and respond to him was like witnessing a miracle unfold every day. Meanwhile, the colony council's rules loomed over him like a shadow. He knew that discovery could bring punishment, yet he also knew that surrendering the cubs would mean certain death for them. He decided to keep their existence as private as possible, revealing only what was necessary to maintain safety. Despite the risk, he could not deny the profound connection he felt with them. Each cub had its own personality. One was bold and adventurous, often testing boundaries. Another was shy and cautious, seeking comfort in his presence. And the smallest was clever, always finding ways to get attention or explore hidden corners of the shelter. The bond extended beyond simple care. The cubs began to recognize him not just as a provider, but as a companion. They would follow him silently when he moved through the settlement, curling close to his legs or peering around corners to ensure he was near. When he spoke, they listened. When he reached for them, they responded without hesitation. It was a silent communication, an understanding that went deeper than words. He marveled at how creatures so different could show loyalty, affection, and recognition in ways humans often failed to do. But life was not without tension. Some workers grew suspicious, asking questions about where he spent his time or why he seemed distracted during inspections. The foreman remained calm, offering explanations that were honest but vague enough to protect the cubs. He knew that curiosity could quickly turn into danger if the colony authorities discovered the truth. Yet, he did not regret the time spent caring for the cubs. Every challenge was worth it when he saw the trust and joy reflected in their eyes. Over time, he also began to notice subtle changes in himself. The cubs' presence affected his patience, his decision-making, and even his perspective on the colony. He had spent years following rules, managing workers, and focusing on survival. Now, his priorities shifted toward nurturing, observation, and compassion. The cubs reminded him of the importance of care over fear, trust over suspicion, and connection over rules. He realized that leadership was not just about authority, it was about responsibility, empathy, and courage, especially when the choices were difficult. One afternoon, a small incident tested his resolve. A cub had wandered too close to the edge of the shelter, near a small drop that could have caused injury. Before he could react, it slipped, landing awkwardly on the ground. He ran to it immediately, checking for injuries. The cub yelped, but seemed mostly unharmed. Relief washed over him, but it was also a stark reminder of how fragile their survival remained. Every moment with the cubs required attention, vigilance, and understanding of their instincts. Despite the risks, the foreman found immense satisfaction in these challenges. Each obstacle overcome, each lesson learned, and each gesture of trust from the cubs strengthened the bond. He taught them to follow simple rules, to respect boundaries, and even to respond to small commands. They learned quickly, showing intelligence, curiosity, and adaptability that surprised him daily. It became clear that these creatures, feared by the entire colony, had the potential to thrive if guided with patience and care. As days turned into weeks, the foreman also noticed the reactions of other workers changing. At first, they had mocked or feared him. Then some grew curious. A few brave souls began observing quietly, noting how the cubs followed his commands and responded to his voice. Slowly, respect replaced fear. People began to see that the cubs were not mindless predators. They were intelligent, responsive, and capable of forming strong bonds. The foreman's patience and courage or becoming a quiet example. Even if no one said it out loud. By the end of this period, the foreman had achieved something remarkable. He had created a space where fear was replaced by trust, danger by guidance, and abandonment by care. The cubs were no longer trembling or defensive. They were playful, curious, and responsive. Their relationship with him was a true partnership, a combination of instinct and learned trust. For the first time, he felt that he was not just saving their lives, he was shaping their future, teaching them that the world could be different, safer, and full of care. Yet, the foreman knew this was only the beginning. The cubs would continue to grow, their strength and instincts increasing with each passing day. The colony council might still discover them, and the world outside the shelter could present dangers he could not control. But he also knew that he had laid the foundation for something extraordinary, a bond that could survive fear, rules, and the unknown challenges ahead. The cubs were no longer simply abandoned predators. They were part of his life, his responsibility, and in many ways, his family. As he watched them play and rest, the foreman realized that these moments of quiet trust, joy, and connection were rare and precious. He understood that every choice he had made, the risks, the sleepless nights, the careful observation, was worth it. The cubs were growing stronger, smarter, and more affectionate, and he was learning just as much from them as they were from him. In a world defined by rules and fear, he had found something extraordinary, the power of compassion, patience, and the unspoken bond between two completely different species. And so, despite the foreman had grown accustomed to the rhythm of life with the cubs. Every day brought new routines, small lessons, and moments of unexpected joy. The cubs were growing stronger, more curious, and surprisingly intelligent. They had learned to follow simple commands, respond to gestures, and even recognize when he was concerned about their safety. Yet, despite all the trust they had built together, the foreman knew that their instincts were still strong. They were apex predators in training, and the world outside the shelter was full of dangers that could test both their abilities and his courage. It was on a morning like any other that the real test arrived. The colony was hit by an unusually violent sandstorm, a storm strong enough to disrupt power systems, delay machinery, and put every worker at risk. Visibility dropped to nearly zero, and the winds howled like wild animals. The foreman was performing his morning rounds when he heard the first alarms, a loud, shrill warning that a structural tower on the site was beginning to collapse. Machines shook, dust filled the air, and panicked cries echoed across the settlement. Without hesitation, he raced toward the site, calling out to his workers, who were trapped under the debris. But as he approached, he realized that human strength alone would not be enough. Massive beams had fallen, blocking access to the injured. His heart pounded as he shouted for help, knowing that time was running out. The sandstorm made it almost impossible for rescue teams to arrive quickly. The foreman understood in that instant that the cubs, now larger and stronger than before, were his only chance to save the trapped workers. He sprinted back to the shelter, where the cubs were waiting, curious and alert. They immediately sensed his urgency, their ears twitching and tails flicking as they followed him to the site. The foreman gave simple commands, guiding them to areas where humans were trapped. To anyone watching, it would have seemed impossible. Apex predators, feared by the colony, now working alongside a human, responding to his voice with precision. The first beam blocked the entrance to a collapsed corridor. The foreman instructed the largest cub to climb and shift it aside. It hesitated for a moment. Then, understanding his command, it used its strength to lift and nudge the beam just enough to create a gap. Workers underneath gasped as they were able to crawl out to safety. Encouraged, the foreman directed the others toward different sections of the collapse. Each cub moved quickly, skillfully, and without hesitation. Their instincts to hunt or attack were replaced, temporarily, by focus, trust, and cooperation. One worker had become pinned under a heavy support column. The foreman signaled to the smallest cub, which surprised him by running directly toward the column. With a combination of clawing, pushing, and careful nudges, it helped shift the debris just enough for the worker to pull himself free. The foreman could hardly believe it. Creatures that had been considered dangerous and uncontrollable were now saving human lives. The scene was chaotic, filled with dust, wind, and fear. But it was also filled with something remarkable: trust between species, and the incredible bond the foreman had nurtured over weeks. As the rescue continued, the foreman felt an overwhelming mix of emotions. He was proud, relieved, and terrified all at once. Every second mattered, and every movement counted. The cubs followed his commands perfectly, understanding the difference between danger and safety, urgency, and caution. Workers who had once mocked or feared these creatures now watched in awe, their disbelief replaced by gratitude and admiration. They realized that the foreman's decision to protect and raise these cubs had not been foolish. It had been courageous, wise, and life-saving. The storm raged on, forcing the foreman and the cubs to move faster. The cubs' agility, combined with their growing strength, allowed them to reach areas humans could not. One cub even lifted a fallen crate that had trapped a worker's leg, while another used its sharp claws to dig through sand and debris. Every action was calculated, precise, and guided by the foreman's instructions. In that moment, the cubs were no longer seen as mere predators. They were partners, guardians, and heroes. When the final worker was freed, the foreman sank to ground, exhausted, dust-covered, and shaking. The cubs circled around him, their eyes bright and alert, sensing both his relief and his lingering fear. They nuzzled him, pressed close to offer comfort, and even allowed him to pat their heads. It was a quiet, intimate moment amid chaos, a reminder that the bond they shared was unbreakable. Tested under fire and proven true. After the storm passed, the colony slowly regained order. Workers checked for injuries, machines were repaired, and emergency protocols were reviewed. News of the cubs' actions spread quickly. People who had once feared or despised them were now filled with admiration. Even the colony supervisors, who had warned the foreman of the dangers, could not deny the reality. These creatures, once considered untamable, had saved multiple lives. The foreman, always modest, refused praise, insisting that the cubs had acted on instinct and trust, not heroism. Yet everyone knew that without him, they would never have learned that trust. The incident also brought a new perspective to the foreman. He realized that the cubs were more than just survivors. They were capable of understanding, responding, and cooperating in ways no human had anticipated. The bond they shared had transformed them from fearful, abandoned creatures into intelligent, capable beings who respected him and valued the lives of others. It was a living proof that patience, compassion, and guidance could overcome even the deepest instincts, despite the exhaustion. He returned to the shelter that evening, knowing that the cubs needed care just as much as the workers they had saved. He tended to their minor injuries, cleaned their fur, and offered them warm food. Watching them eat, he felt a deep sense of gratitude, not just for their actions, but for their trust, loyalty, and companionship. Each cub had learned to respond to him, to follow his lead, and to understand safety. In their eyes, he saw recognition, affection, and a bond that went beyond species or words. The foreman also knew that this event would change the colony's view of the cubs permanently. People would no longer see them as mere predators to be feared. They would be seen as intelligent beings, capable of forming bonds, understanding commands, and even cooperating with humans. This realization filled him with hope, but also with a quiet responsibility. The cubs had proven their worth, but their lives were still fragile. And the challenges of raising apex predators in a human settlement were far from over. That night, as the foreman lay down beside the cubs in the shelter, he reflected on everything that had happened. The fear, the criticism, the endless challenges, they had all led to this moment of triumph. The cubs were safe, the workers were alive, and the bond they shared had been tested and strengthened. He understood that this was only the beginning of their journey. The cubs would continue to grow, their strength and instincts increasing with each passing day. But now, he had evidence that trust, guidance, and care could shape even the most dangerous creature's doubt as he drifted into a restless sleep. The cubs curled around him, their warmth and presence offering comfort after a day of chaos. He knew that tomorrow would bring new challenges, more growth, new dangers, and perhaps even the scrutiny of the colony council. But he also knew that the bond they had formed was stronger than any obstacle. The cubs were no longer just abandoned creatures. They were his companions, his students, and his family. In the quiet of the shelter, the foreman made a silent promise. No matter what came next, he would protect the cubs, guide them, and ensure that they lived in a world where they were safe, understood, and respected. And in that moment, as the stars of the alien sky began to twinkle above the settlement, he felt a deep sense of peace. The storm had tested them. The cubs had proven themselves, and together they had survived. Together, they would continue to face the unknown, one day at a time, with trust, courage, and an unbreakable bond. After the dramatic events of the storm, the foreman realized that the cubs were no longer just helpless creatures in need of protection. They had become something much more. Their instincts were strong, but their trust in him had grown stronger. They had proven themselves capable of understanding his guidance and even cooperating in critical situations. What had once seemed impossible, the idea that these feared predators could live safely alongside humans, was slowly becoming reality. The foreman felt a deep sense of pride and responsibility. He knew that the colony's perception of these creatures was beginning to change, and that his role as their caretaker was more important than ever. Over the next few weeks, he focused on helping the cubs grow in a safe and controlled environment. He began creating routines that balanced play, training, and exploration. Every morning, he would wake early and take them outside the shelter, guiding them through obstacle courses he had built with materials from the colony. These courses were not just for exercise. They were lessons in coordination, patience, and awareness. He wanted the cubs to be strong, but also careful, to understand their own power and how to control it. The cubs thrived under his guidance. The largest one, once shy and cautious, now bounded over obstacles with confidence. The smallest, cleverest of them all learned quickly how to navigate the courses and even began anticipating the foreman's gestures. Watching them, he realized how much intelligence and adaptability these creatures possessed. Their behavior was no longer just instinct, it was learning, problem-solving, and responding to care and guidance. He could see their personalities more clearly now. Curiosity, playfulness, protectiveness, and loyalty all shone through in different ways. Word of their growing capabilities spread through the colony. Some workers who had been skeptical or fearful now came to observe quietly, unable to deny what they were witnessing. The cubs were responding to the foreman's commands, interacting with humans safely, and even showing care for one another. Slowly, the colony began to see that these creatures, once considered dangerous, could be valuable members of the settlement. The foreman, however, never let praise distract him. He was focused on the cubs' development, knowing that trust and training were fragile and required constant attention. One day, the foreman noticed an opportunity to demonstrate the cubs' potential in a practical way. A small team had been working near the forest boundary, and one worker slipped and became trapped in a difficult-to-reach area. The foreman calmly called the cubs to his side. They immediately understood the urgency and followed him. The largest cub climbed a rocky ledge to help lift debris, while the smallest used its agility to find a safe path for the worker to escape. The foreman guided them with patience, keeping both the worker and the cub safe. The rescue was a success, and for the first time, the colony truly recognized the cub's value, not just as creatures to be feared, but as intelligent beings capable of protecting humans. After that incident, the foreman began teaching the cubs more advanced skills. He worked on obedience training, teaching them to respond quickly to voice commands, gestures, and even subtle cues like changes in tone. He also encouraged social behavior, guiding them to interact safely with humans and other animals in the colony. The cubs learned quickly, their natural intelligence amplified by his consistent, patient guidance. It was remarkable to see how much they were capable of when fear was replaced by trust, and when their strength was guided with care. The cubs' transformation was not just physical or behavioral, it was also emotional. They had grown attached to the foreman in a way that went beyond instinct. They sought comfort from him, played with him, and even displayed protective behavior. One afternoon, when a stray animal approached too closely to the shelter, the cubs surrounded the foreman, growling softly, ready to defend him. It was a clear sign that they understood their bond, and that loyalty and trust had become as important as survival. As the weeks passed, the foreman's efforts began to reshape the colony's attitude toward the cubs. Supervisors and workers alike were amazed at how the creatures responded to training, protected humans, and showed intelligence beyond what had been expected. The cubs were no longer seen as mere threats. They were becoming colony protectors, capable of helping in dangerous situations and even assisting with routine tasks that required agility or strength. The foreman watched with quiet satisfaction, knowing that patience, care, and courage had made all the difference. The foreman also worked closely with the colony scientists, who began studying the cubs in more detail. They were fascinated by the speed of their learning, their emotional responses, and their ability to bond across species. The foreman shared his observations, explaining how small gestures, patience, and trust had shaped their behavior. Scientists began to document the cubs' growth and development, noting how much their intelligence and adaptability could benefit the colony if guided properly. The foreman realized that he was not just raising creatures. He was shaping a new understanding of coexistence and cooperation between humans and apex predators. As the cubs grew, they also became more independent. The foreman gradually allowed them to explore the forest and the surrounding colony areas under careful supervision. They learned to navigate the terrain, recognize potential dangers, and even locate hidden resources. Their natural instincts remained strong, but they were tempered by the guidance and care they had received. The foreman marveled at how capable they had become, understanding that their potential was limitless as long as they continued to learn and grow. Under proper supervision, the cubs' presence brought new energy to the colony. Workers who had once feared the creatures now respected them, and even sought their help in certain tasks. The foreman's role evolved from simple caretaker to leader and mentor. He taught others how to interact with the cubs safely, how to observe their behavior, and how to guide them when necessary. Slowly, a community began to form around the cubs, one built on trust, respect, and cooperation. The colony was learning that fear could be replaced with understanding, and that even the most feared creatures could be allies rather than threats. One of the most remarkable changes was in the cubs themselves. They began to show a sense of responsibility and awareness beyond what the foreman had expected. They were playful, yes, but also careful and protective. When new workers arrived, the cubs would approach cautiously, allowing them to observe and interact safely. When dangers arose, they responded quickly and efficiently, guided by the foreman's commands. It was a true transformation from abandoned, feared creatures to intelligent, respected protectors. The foreman often reflected on how far they had come. He remembered the first day he had found them, weak, injured, and abandoned in the forest. Back then, he had worried constantly, wondering if they would survive, if the colony would ever accept them, or if he had made a mistake by taking them in. Now, weeks later, the cubs had grown stronger, smarter, and more connected to him and the colony than he could have imagined. His decision, once considered reckless, had become a turning point not just for the cubs, but for the entire settlement. Despite the progress, the foreman never let complacency take hold. He continued daily training, observation, and care. He understood that their growth, strength, and instincts meant that mistakes could be dangerous. Every lesson had to be reinforced, every behavior carefully guided. He remained patient, consistent, and vigilant, knowing that true trust and safety were earned, not given. The cubs had proven themselves, but their journey was far from over. The bond between the foreman and the cubs had also grown deeper than ever. They sought his presence constantly, following him through the colony, curling close when he rested, and responding instantly to his gestures. The foreman had become more than a caretaker. He was a guide, a teacher, and a member of their small family. In return, the cubs offered loyalty, companionship, and protection. Their connection was a testament to what patience, empathy, and trust could achieve, even between completely different species, by the end of this stage in their journey. The foreman realized that the cubs had not only adapted to life with humans, they had transformed the colony's understanding of them. Fear and mistrust were being replaced by respect, curiosity, and appreciation. The cubs were no longer seen as mere apex predators. They were intelligent, loyal, and capable of great things. The foreman understood that this transformation was a result of care, consistency, and the belief that even the most feared creatures could learn to coexist peacefully with humans. As night fell, the foreman watched the cubs curl up together in their shelter. They had grown stronger, wiser, and more capable, yet they still sought his guidance and presence. He reflected on the journey they had shared from abandoned, trembling babies in the forest to skilled, trusted protectors of the colony. The cubs had changed not only the colony's perception, but also his own understanding of leadership, responsibility, and the power of compassion. He knew that the future would bring new challenges, that their growth would continue, and that their instincts would always remain strong. But he also knew that together they could face whatever came their way. The cubs had proven that trust and guidance could overcome fear, that patience could shape strength, and that loyalty could. The cubs had grown. What had once been small, trembling creatures huddled in a forest clearing were now powerful, intelligent, and majestic beings. Their fur shimmered in the alien sun, muscles rippled under their strong bodies, and their eyes held a sharp intelligence that made it clear they were no longer babies. Yet despite their size and strength, they had not lost the trust and affection they felt for the foreman. In fact, that bond had grown even stronger over time, rooted in the countless days and nights of care, guidance, and shared experiences. The foreman watched them carefully, noting how naturally they moved through the colony now. They were agile, aware, and controlled, even as their instincts remained sharp. He had worked tirelessly to ensure that their growing power would be tempered by understanding and discipline, and it had paid off. Every movement, every response, and every interaction they had with humans demonstrated a deep awareness of boundaries, a recognition of trust, and a willingness to cooperate. It was extraordinary. Life in the colony had changed as well. People who had once feared these apex predators now treated them with respect. They saw what the foreman had always known. These creatures were not monsters to be destroyed, but intelligent beings capable of loyalty, compassion, and courage. Children could safely watch them from a distance. Workers could pass without fear, and even the colony council began to quietly acknowledge the unique role they played in maintaining safety and harmony. The foreman felt a quiet satisfaction, knowing that the cubs had not only survived, but had transformed the way the colony understood life and coexistence. The most remarkable part, however, was how the cubs themselves had matured. Each one had its own personality, sharpened and refined over time. The largest cub, once bold and cautious in equal measure, now carried itself with confidence and grace, aware of both its power and its responsibilities. The smallest, cleverest of the group had become strategic, able to anticipate situations and act with precision. And the others had developed their own unique skills, from agility and strength to intelligence and curiosity. Together, they were more than just creatures. They were a team, a family, and a reflection of the foreman's patience and dedication. Despite their growth, they remained deeply connected to him. Every morning, they would gather near his quarters, waiting for him to emerge, their ears flicking, tails swishing, and eyes bright with recognition. When he called, they approached without hesitation. When he extended a hand, they nuzzled it gently, a simple gesture of trust and love that had been nurtured over months. The foreman realized that this bond was unlike anything he had experienced before. These were not pets, not machines, not tools. They were companions in the truest sense, capable of understanding, loyalty, and affection. Their strength was undeniable, but so was their restraint. The foreman had ensured that they understood the difference between danger and safety, between aggression and protection. When workers approached, the cubs maintained their composure, observing without threatening. When unknown creatures entered the colony, they reacted only under his guidance. Their instincts remained, but they had learned to channel them constructively. It was a rare balance of wildness and control, instinct and trust, a living testament to the foreman's care and the potential for coexistence. That the foreman spent hours reflecting on their journey. He remembered the first day he had found them abandoned, weak, and despised by everyone. Back then, survival seemed uncertain, and every choice had been fraught with risk. Now, months later, they had not only survived, they had thrived. Their growth was not just physical. It was emotional, intellectual, and social. They had learned to trust, to respond, and to act responsibly, and in doing so, they had become extraordinary beings. One day, the foreman decided it was time to test them further. He led the cubs on a controlled exploration beyond the colony boundaries, into the denser parts of the alien forest. This was their world, and he wanted them to experience it fully, safely, under his guidance. The cubs moved with precision and awareness, alert to every sound, smell, and movement. They navigated obstacles, avoided dangers, and even helped each other when a tricky path presented itself. The foreman observed with pride and amazement these creatures, once abandoned and weak, were now fully capable of surviving in the wild. Yet they still chose to remain connected to him. During this expedition, they encountered a young predator from another pack, aggressive and untrained. The foreman remained calm, signaling the cubs to stand their ground. They responded instantly, positioning themselves between him and the intruder. The situation could have escalated into a fight, but instead, the cubs displayed remarkable restraint. They growled and postured to warn, but did not attack. The intruder eventually backed down, and the foreman realized that their intelligence, training, and bond had prevented a potential disaster. It was proof that they had truly matured, able to control instincts through trust and guidance. Back in the colony, the cubs' role expanded beyond companionship. They became guardians, assisting with safety, monitoring the perimeter, and helping during emergencies. Workers who once feared them now respected their judgment. They were no longer seen as unpredictable predators, but as loyal, intelligent protectors. The foreman had achieved something remarkable. He had taken abandoned creatures, despised and feared, and transformed them into beings capable of heroism, cooperation, and trust. Despite their abilities, the foreman never allowed complacency. He continued daily routines, reinforcing trust, obedience, and awareness. He taught them to respond to subtle cues, to recognize potential threats, and to act with precision. Every day was a reminder that power without guidance could be dangerous, but power paired with understanding and loyalty could be extraordinary. The cubs had learned this lesson well, and their actions reflected the foreman's dedication and wisdom. The colony began to celebrate their uniqueness. The cubs were recognized not just as creatures of strength, but as symbols of possibility, proof that fear could be replaced by trust, and that compassion could create extraordinary bonds. Children watched them safely from a distance. Workers collaborated without fear, and the council quietly acknowledged their contributions. The foreman felt a sense of fulfillment, knowing that his efforts had not only saved lives, but had also changed perspectives, teaching the colony a new way to understand the world around them. One quiet evening, the foreman sat outside with the cubs resting at his feet. The alien sun was setting, casting long shadows across the settlement. He thought about the journey they had shared, from the forest clearing where they were abandoned, through the storms, the training, the rescues, and the countless days of care and guidance. Each moment had shaped them, and each decision he had made had tested his courage, patience, and wisdom. The cubs, once helpless, were now fully capable, loyal, and connected to him in a bond that could not be broken. He realized that this was more than a story of survival. It was a story of transformation. The cubs had transformed from abandoned predators into intelligent, loyal guardians. The colony had transformed from fear and suspicion into respect and appreciation. And he himself had transformed, learning lessons about patience, compassion, and the extraordinary power of trust. It was a journey that had challenged every part of him, yet had rewarded him in ways he could never have imagined. As night fell, the cubs curled around him, their warmth and presence a comforting reminder of everything they had achieved together. They were strong, capable, and intelligent, yet they still sought his guidance, companionship, and protection. The foreman knew that their story was far from over. The future would bring new challenges, new adventures, and new lessons, but he also knew that together they could face anything. The bond they shared had been tested, proven, and strengthened, and it was unbreakable. The foreman whispered softly to the cubs, words of gratitude and pride, and they responded with gentle nuzzles and soft purrs, their trust and affection clear. He reflected on the journey, from that first day in the forest to the present moment. Every risk, every sleepless night, every moment of doubt had been worth it. The cubs had not only survived, they had thrived, learned, and grown into beings capable of incredible things. And in that moment, the foreman understood the true meaning of responsibility, compassion, and trust. He had taken in the abandoned, the despised, and the feared, and through care, courage, and unwavering dedication, had transformed them into something extraordinary. The cubs were more than predators. They were family, companions, and a living testament to what could be achieved when fear was replaced by understanding and care. As the stars of the alien sky began to shine, the foreman looked at the cubs and felt a deep sense of fulfillment. Their journey was complete in one sense. They had grown, matured, and proven themselves. But in another, it was only the beginning. Together, they would face the future, not as human and predator, but as a team, a family, and a symbol of trust and hope. The foreman knew that no matter what challenges came, their bond would remain unshakable, a testament to the power of care, courage, and the extraordinary possibilities that arise when compassion leads the way.